All right, without further ado, let's get into our first panel. So each speaker will give a brief presentation centered on a map, a place, or a mapping practice. Then the chair and the speakers will discuss the panel's theme before opening the floor to questions from the audience. So the online audience and the in-the-room audience can both ask questions. For those of you who are online, please type your question into the question feed, which is just below your live stream. Just scroll down a little bit. And then for those of you in the room, please write your question on the postcard that was provided on your seat. You might be sitting on it. There are also pens at the back if anyone needs one. And if you have a question when you've written it on your postcard, hold that up. One of the organizers will come and grab that, and then they will pass those questions to the chair, and then we'll answer those at the end. If we can't get to all questions, the speakers can answer those afterwards if relevant. So this first panel is on cartographic encounters with empire. We have Ed Armston-Sheret, most recently the author of On the Backs of Others, Rethinking the History of British Geographical Exploration, and who is the professional officer for higher education teaching and learning here at the Society. Sujit Sivasundaram is Professor of World History at the University of Cambridge. His most recent book is Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire, although I am still a very big fan of Nature and the Godly Empire, which is about science and missionaries in the 19th century Pacific. So we're going to be starting with Ed.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk to you today about 12 sketch maps produced by John Hanningspeak and Richard Burton on their 1856 to 1859 expedition to try and find the source of the River Nile. The expedition was sponsored by the Royal Geographical Society and represents an important moment in Britain's growing involvement in East Africa. The maps themselves were produced in November 1857 from the field of this expedition. And I think that is exactly what makes them so interesting. They sit at the intersection of geographical science, imperial expansion, and dependence on African expertise. This is an overview showing sort of how the maps fit together. Because they're on 12 different pieces of paper, it's quite difficult to show them on the slides, and I hope we get a chance to look at them later in detail in the foil reading room. Europeans had long believed the source of the Nile lay in some lake in Central Africa, but by the early 19th century, shifting standards of scientific credibility meant that only first-hand observations would suffice to identify and map it accurately in the eyes of metropolitan geographers. And efforts to chart the rivers of Africa were deeply entwined with growing imperial and commercial expansion in the continent. David Livingstone, a contemporary of Speak's, for example, tried to explore the Zambezi, hoping that it would be a highway into the interior of Africa, opening the continent up to commerce and Christianity. So on one level, we can read this map as part of a broader story, a document marking the early stages of British exploration, a process that would ultimately lead to imperial control over these regions by the end of the 19th century. And you can see the sort of the route in red is the route depicted in the map. This is just a sort of a modern map that gives you some sense of where in the world you're looking at. But on another level, the map tells a very different story, one that highlights African agency and the explorers' dependence. The route shown on the map follows a pre-existing trade route running between Zanzibar and the interior, used since the early 19th century by caravans carrying both cloth and beads inland and returning with ivory and enslaved people. Both Burton and Speak, when they were travelling on this journey, also used the flag of the Zanzibari state. They had the red flag of Zanzibar flying at the head of their caravan rather than the British flag. So. And this slide here, you can see that it's got one of the settlements marked on it is Unyanyembe, which is listed as an Arab settlement, which I think illustrates that there were Arab traders and merchants living and travelling to this part of Africa before the explorers arrived. And lots of the stops that are marked on the map actually represent sort of camps that were ordinary camps where people would resupply on this caravan route. The other really interesting thing that you can find in the RGS collections is some photographs of the people who made this this journey possible, and these included Nyamwezi porters who were from the sort of central area of modern-day Tanzania. And this is a photo taken on Speke and Grant's later 1860 expedition in Zanzibar, and at the bottom, Grant writes that describes the physical strength of the Nyamwezi porters who made the journey possible. They would carry the explorers' supplies, their equipment, and often do much of the day-to-day navigation of this route. Many of them have probably done this journey several times before they joined Burton and Speke's expedition. And when the explorers got ill, they were carried on the shoulders of porters. Seen in this light, the map looks very different. It's not a record of men hacking through unexplored jungle, but of Europeans moving along pre-established African trade routes. The next thing that I think is really interesting about this map is how it shows the reliance of the European explorers on African oral information. And it says at the bottom here, the sea is said to increase in breadth south of this point, basically. And so what is visible on this map is lots of information that the explorers hadn't directly seen themselves, but had heard about through conversations with both members of their own party and the Arab traders and merchants who are living in the area. The other thing you see in this is the blank space, the bit of the lake they cannot reach. And that is also, I think, a monument to both the explorers' weakness. They got really ill, basically, ran out of supplies, and there was also sort of hostility amongst the local population at this end of the lake, which meant they couldn't physically travel any further. So the blank spaces of the map don't just show the limits of geographical knowledge, they also reveal the explorers' physical weakness and the fragility of their enterprise. And focusing on the dependence of explorers on this oral information also can be a window into looking at some of the people who made who translated this oral information to the explorers. So this is Mubarak Bombay. He was he was of Yao heritage and was born somewhere between the border of Mozambique and Tanzania in about 1820. And he's enslaved as a child, transported to India. Eventually he's released after his master in India dies, and he comes back to Zanzibar. And he then joins Burton and Speke's expedition. But because he had lived in India, he could speak Hindustani, and Burton and Speke, having served in the Indian Army, could also speak this language. And so he was a key translator on this expedition, translating conversations with local people and Arab traders they encountered to the explorers. So lots of this African knowledge that's incorporated on the map would have been translated by Bombay. He also became very interested in the geographical work of the expedition. As this quote here says, Speke describes him as a great geographer who delights in pointing out features to his neighbours. And then the final thing that you can really see, focus on in this map is the illness of the explorers. In this quote, Burton describes how he has like vivid hallucinations. I had during the fever fit and often for hours afterwards a queer conviction of divided identity, never ceasing to be two persons that generally thwarted and opposed each other. The sleepless nights brought with them horrid visions, animals of grisliest form, hag-like women and men with heads protruding from their breasts. So this gives you some sense of how ill the explorers were on their expedition. And with the map sent from East Africa in 1857, Speke included like a cover letter when he addressed it to the Royal Geographical Society. And in it, he sort of describes how ill they were when they were travelling. And he comments on how much this affected his confidence in the observations contained in the map. And I think the final thing that focusing on the explorer's illness tells us is again how they often had to be carried. And Burton described how on the road the porters would often carry them, hurrying forwards, recklessly dashing the manchet, which is the stretcher, against stock and stone. So he uses his own suffering while being carried to draw attention back to his own experiences of the expedition and kind of away from the labour of those he depended on. So overall, these maps can be read in two ways. On the one hand, they are documents of imperial science, marking a moment when Europeans sought to map Africa more precisely and extend their influence. But they can also be read as records of dependence, showing how explorers relied on African guides, local knowledge, African labour, and on oral information. For example, there's also lots of other little notes where it sort of says things like supposed to be hilly over here and things like that. If you look at it, map it later, it's really really pays dividends looking at it for a long period of time because there's so much there. Later, when they published the official versions of these maps, such oral sources were far less visible, and lots of the information that they'd only heard about was drawn in very clear, precise lines on their maps. So this shift marks an important change from explorers as collaborative field workers to explorers as solitary men of science, which is how they tried to depict themselves when they got back. In this sense, the maps capture not just the geography of East Africa, but also the complex human geographies of exploration itself, of collaboration, weakness, and intercultural encounter, and the many forms of knowledge that made mapping possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is actually perfect because I was discussing that expedition with Cambridge undergraduates just a couple of weeks ago. So it seems perfect to be here. And it's really wonderful to be at the RGS as well because I've wanted to visit properly for quite some time. So today I have about 10 minutes, and so I could talk about maps in various different ways. But one abiding interest of mine is Sri Lanka. And so I'm going to organize my comments around Sri Lanka in what follows. At the moment, and just to do like a 10-second advert, I run this collaborative project, including a lot of people from Sri Lanka, postdoctoral fellows, doctoral students at the University of Cambridge on the long history of the city of Colombo. And the website is colombohistories.org. And so I'll be drawing on that project in the few minutes that I have. If you'd like to know more information, just look up the website. But before I go to the city, I want to go to the island. So I'm going to structure these comments around the island and the city. And those are the 2 points that I will be making through the course of these comments. So on Sri Lanka, it's easy to say that outsiders represented it over centuries in exaggerated ways on maps. Recently, in a piece called The Global and the Earthy, I focused attention on the gigantically proportioned island of Taprobane, which is often said to come from Ptolemy's Geographia. The cartographic rendition of this island, said to be today's Sri Lanka, is approximately 12 times the extent of present-day Sri Lanka. Right? And this tradition kind of carries through the early modern period. It's repeated over and over again. By the way, that first image was from the Burney collection, who was a musical scholar, I believe, and it's at the British Library. But really one could trace the reverberations of this notion of Taprobane as an anomalous island through actually many, many centuries. And one of the things I'm interested in is how also it gets connected to anomalous natural history. The best elephants come from this island. The longest, richest pepper comes from this island. And as these maps get recycled and redrawn, one thing that's interesting is the elephants change as well. The elephants become a bit more docile as we go through the period, but we can discuss that later. But this outsiderly view did not only arise from Europe over centuries, because the idea of this island, this anomalous island at the middle of the Indian Ocean, also fed into Arab and Islamic cosmography. And so one could argue that there was a kind of trade in the image of the anomalous island across these different traditions and cultural traditions of exploration across the Indian Ocean. So this is a 20th century Sri Lankan reproduction of the Moroccan-born and Sicily-based Muhammad al-Idrisi's image of Lanka from the 12th century, and the island is in the center. But even if West Asians, if we call them West Asians, and see this as a West Asian map, and even as we might bring in West Asians and Europeans and the long classical tradition of the mythologization of this anomalous island, which just doesn't seem to fit into the story, we've also got to bring in islander kind of perspectives and islander cartographic renditions. And what's really super interesting is that there is a kind of anomalous way about thinking about the changeability of the land amongst indigenous narrations as well. And here one needs to go to the Mahavamsa, which is a Buddhist chronicle written in the 6th, 13th, and 18th centuries. Today, it's a cherished source of nationalism in Sri Lanka, a point that I wish to highlight and we can return to later. The account of how the sea encroached on the kingdom based in Kalanir, and I'll be returning to Kalanir later in talking about Colombo, during the reign of Kalanithissa illustrates the genre perfectly. The reader is told of the foolishness of Kalanithissa's brother, Aya Uthika, who sleeps with the queen and therefore rouses the wrath of his brother. Having fled Kalanithissa's kingdom, Aya Uthika sends a man disguised as a Buddhist priest with a secret letter to the queen. This is discovered by the king, who slays the man and throws him into the sea. The author of the Mahavamsa presents this as a fitful deed of anger, unsuitable for the monarch. After all, the priest and his attendant were innocent. It was the king's brother who was guilty. The Mahavamsa continues, wroth at this, the sea gods made the sea overflow the land. Another chronicle, the 17th century Rajavalya, records, on account of the wickedness of Kalanithissa, 100,000 seaport towns, 970 fishers' villages, and 470 villages of pearl fishers, making altogether 11 twelfths of Lanka, was submerged by the Great Sea. There are various other boundary texts and geographical kind of texts which we can bring into the story. I don't have time to do that here. But really what I'm trying to kind of illustrate is that there's a difficulty in comprehending and mapping this island on so many different perspectives, from different perspectives. There's a danger of simply kind of taking the Western texts out and replacing them with Arab texts, or taking the Arab texts out and replacing them with Lankan texts. But really there's a sort of symmetry on all sides. And so what I'm advocating for more generally is that we need to look at all of this stuff in the same frame. And if we put that all together and see that all together as a kind of set of mapping traditions, what we get to is this really kind of curious sort of space, an island which resists mapping in so many ways and which is confounding, which people can't come to terms with. And so you need all these ways of thinking about cartography from so many different cultural traditions if you are to come to terms with this changeable, and of course there have been tidal waves, island called Sri Lanka at the center of the Indian Ocean. And maybe that's still the case today. Okay, so now I'm jumping from the kind of outsiderly and the indigenous, if one wants to call it that, and the Islamicate, to really the practices of colonialism, which I take to be something quite else. And here I'm interested actually in lived experience in the city of Colombo. Now, just to introduce the city of Colombo very much in sort of schematic form here, because I don't have much time to go into details. At one point it was a Muslim settlement. Then it became Portuguese. From the first trading post was built in 1518. Then it became Dutch, 1656 to 1796. Then it became British, 1796 to 1948. And now this, right? So it's like incredibly layered. It's not singularly colonized, it's multiply colonized, and actually has encountered what is a very long process of colonization, which has reverberations even into the Chinese moment that we're living in today. So in approaching Sri Lanka's history like this, I'm trying to kind of actually just ground it in the space of Sri Lanka rather than work with this idea of Taprobane. And so here one should go to colonial maps. And perhaps the first map, quote unquote, is Gaspar Carrera's Portuguese image from Lenda da India, which is a hand-drawn image. And what's really super interesting about it is that here, this is actually, again, I'm actually using here slightly grainy images, but these are the images in the Sri Lankan National Archives, which I'm using now. So I want to actually bring you the maps from the Sri Lankan National Archives and show you what they look like. So this is called a map. And in the middle is the sort of early 16th century image, which is a Portuguese image. And if you zoom in a little bit, actually this is, I mean, it's been reproduced various times, right? In this kind of rendition, this is actually, for a reason I can discuss later, the image of the map in what is said to be the first building in Colombo, which is a claim made by Muslims to actually residents in the city. Muslims are now minoritized in the city, and claiming the map, I would argue, in some ways is a way of kind of asserting presence. So it's not simply a Portuguese map. It's certainly a Portuguese colonial map in various ways, but it's also appropriated for various cultural and social reasons in Colombo. And this is actually my photograph from the trustees' room of the Colombo Grand Mosque. But if you look at it carefully, what you see is that it's not totally accurate, clearly. You have the Portuguese fort on that slip of land in the middle, and then you've got that bridge over the river. And this is a sort of a feature that keeps reappearing in later colonial era maps. How do we contend with the watery geography of the space? How do we contend with the coastline and its changeability? How do we contend, with the marshes? What you can see beneath the fort is actually marshy ground. And what's really crucial to keep in mind in thinking about the long history of Colombo is that this wasn't a natural harbor. This was a wetland geography that was actually repeatedly engineered by the Portuguese, by the Dutch, by the British, through lakes, through canals, through breakwaters, now by the Chinese, to become a major harbor at the middle of the Indian Ocean. So really, what you needed was to kind of insert all of these practices into the land of Colombo and into that marshy ground, which you see at the bottom of that fortification, which is Portuguese. Meanwhile, various communities, including Muslim communities, have had to kind of appropriate that sort of cartographic impulse in this image, which reproduced here in 1948 is on the side called the earliest map, right? So this is interpreted as a map and actually as a claim to territory, though maybe it isn't a map to some of us. And then when you go forward in time, and here actually is, by the way, is, this is where the mosque is. This is where we actually, built the first mosque through that arrow pointed there in the middle of the map. And this is once again reproduced in the later 20th century. So moving forward in time, what you get is, once again, in the British period, and here we're getting into the late 18th century with the arrival of the British, really an interest in waterways, causeways, coasts, waterways, coasts, and shores. But here, actually going into the sea itself, as you can see from this map from the Sri Lanka National Archives, here really mapping the ground of the sea as well. And then really the connection between this aesthetic of, understanding the ecology and changing the ecology and the plantation over the ecology. This is a Dutch era map. So really, I'm kind of giving you just three instances of Portuguese, British, and Dutch kind of era maps to give you a sense really of how this works. But really there's sort of logic, the logic then is about changing the land, changing the coastline, and developing a harbor. And this is something that then reoccurs in the late British period, and this is a series of images. Actually, this image comes from an album in the Cambridge University Library, and it's an infrastructural project at the end of the 19th century to calm the monsoonal waves and to allow steamships to actually call at this port, which is so tempestuous in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And in some ways, this is also cartographic, I would argue, right? Because, some of the other images are very linear in the way they're trying to calm these. The waves don't really look like this, but actually it's somewhat romanticized in the way it's trying to kind of envisage the role of infrastructure. So what I'm suggesting really is that the long colonization of the city of Colombo required infrastructure in a wetland geography, and that actually necessitated cartographic practices of all kinds in maps, but also in images and through, bricks and stone and things like this as well. Meanwhile, beneath all of that, really, it was much more complicated because a wetland geography and its peoples can't just be, transformed into a kind of capitalist port in the middle of the Indian Ocean, one of the early sites really for the origins of tourism, I would argue, because of the steamships going between Egypt and Sri Lanka and on the way to Australia in the early 20th century. The whole idea of being in transit actually comes through sites like this. But beneath all of that, really what's going on is, bits of breakwater getting washed away by monsoon winds and waves, people writing petitions, saying that they don't want to be part of this infrastructural project, problems with sewage, problems with flooding, which is a repeated issue in the history of the city. So really, in a sense, you can't change a wetland geography and communities on the ground through processes of mapping like this. So to conclude, to argue like this is not to forget earlier arguments about the relations of maps and colonial power, or to think about how maps create grids into which lands and people fit. Rather, it's to show how island seas, terrains, and marshes can overwhelm the logics of the mapping impulse. And to understand mapping, we need to think more broadly than the traditional sheet which we unroll on our tables in libraries and archives to other modes of mapping, in modes of tale-telling, in palm leaf texts and cartographic imaginations on all sides, and to place maps within, and I've not done this enough, can do more later, local ecologies and deep engagement with particular societies in the global south too. Thank you.
Okay, so now we are going to move into kind of an open discussion, and if you have any questions for those in the room, please write those on those postcards and hold them up, and my colleagues will come and collect them. And for those online, just scroll down a little bit on your screens and pop a question into the box there. I've appropriated your pen. Do you want it back, Ed? All right. Mine now. Okay. So I think there's a lot of congruencies that we can pick up on between those two. But first I kind of want to step back and talk about just the theme broadly. So I wanted to kind of start with the idea of how does map making feature in what you, Sujit, have called, quote, the surveillance regime of the expanding colonial state, end quote. And that's from Waves Across the South.
Oh, right, okay.
I was like, let me tell you where your quote is from. So just how does map making feature into ideas about surveillance, the colonial state, and how does that kind of feature in your work as well, Ed?
Am I going first? Yeah.
You can.
Okay. Yeah, so I think maps are really crucial to state making. So just if I use the example of Colombo, because I've just brought it to view in what I just said there. So there will be a lot of maps in the later 19th century about, I was looking at them, in fact, in trying to choose the right ones for this presentation, about lighting, or about sewage, or about canals. So really techniques of state making. And so one could argue that for statecraft and colonial statecraft to proceed, certainly, and to think through the kind of very practical kind of means through which colonial power is enacted, mapping is really crucial. Tied in with this is also maybe surveillance, because I guess that what's going on in the city is that, and it was perhaps just briefly evident in the tourist map, which I showed you from the 1950s, is that the city is being separated out into different neighborhoods. And so for quite a while there was, the so-called white town and the black town. And so in some ways, the area where elites, colonial elites would live is different to the area where people of color would live. And so there are different sorts of practices of kind of sociability and different practices of maybe even, watching on the street that then unfold. It's not just two areas, by the way, it's multiple areas like this that then emerge as the city grows. So it also divides along class lines, as Lankan elites would be in some areas, and more working class communities go to other areas. And it's not exact, I should say, either. But clearly the kind of growth of the city as a sort of terrain which is mapped in various ways and managed and planned in various ways generates practices of surveillance as well. So I think that state making and surveillance are really crucial to the mapping impulse. I mean, what I probably would say is, just picking up some of the comments I just made, is that it's not the only way to think about it, right? Because the thing about these thing about maps is that they're operating at all of these different levels of imagination, of intent, of tale-telling, and so simply to kind of foreground practices of surveillance and state-making would probably not be sufficient.
I'm thinking so often about how you would map these networks of something like sewage and things like that, but then as you pointed out, the geography itself or sewage can kind of come back to bite you. So it's all about control, and yet sometimes it's not a controllable space.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's also the point that I was trying to make.
I suppose I've looked at it maybe from a slightly different perspective, and to bring it back to the sort of efforts to try and understand the Nile and its relationship to the lakes in Central Africa. I guess what I found really interesting about it is this region doesn't get sort of fully mapped until a much later period and until the expeditions of Henry Morton Stanley. And he travels in a very different way from Burton and Speke, whereas they were much more sort of vulnerable and dependent on the communities they travelled through, and they often couldn't get to places because the people there didn't want them and they were ill, so they got kind of told to go back the other way, and then they didn't find the outlet of the lake, and they weren't able to follow it to the coast. Whereas Stanley, he does a much more, the people even at the time were describing it as sort of piratical expeditions, where he was sort of, he would get his porters and he would chain them up in slave chains. He would take hostages from local communities if they didn't want to exchange food with him. And he travelled, he used much more weapons on his expeditions, would get in battles with African communities encountered. And that's really different from Burton and Speke, who kind of just tried to avoid conflict most of the time. And so this area gets mapped through violence, essentially. The more, like, it's only through a process of increased European involvement and increased violence that they're able to fully map this area. So, so I think there is this real link between, like, the expansion of European empires, the expansion of the imperial state, and map making in this context.
And I think there's also a chronological element that jived really interestingly between your two papers, in that we're kind of looking at the fieldwork side of things with you. And so, like you said, in many ways, the imperial apparatus will follow after this. So this kind of what we call exploration in that sense is a harbinger for later kind of, you can call them surveillance networks or other imperial processes that are to follow. Whereas with Colombo, you were showing us a kind of a longer durée about how different empires and then within that, other than municipal authorities and other types of authority, are going to map this space, and the ways in which those maps can then actually be reappropriated. I think that the Grand Mosque example is really interesting, because they're not interested in that map so much as an imperial object, but the fact that it has that first status is then allowing kind of more political conversations to be had about the city today. So those changing meanings, I think, are really interesting to play out as well. Playing on Ed's wider work in his recent book, mapping can be considered an embodied process, particularly for the examples you were showing us with Speke and Burton, and knowing as we do that both Speke and Burton get so ill on that expedition in ways that would really make most modern readers turn green. Yeah. And they're not too shy about describing it, really. So I just wondered if you both could talk a bit more about mapping as embodied practice in kind of in varied ways. Maybe Ed, if you wanted to.
Yeah. Well, I think what's really interesting is in this period you have this challenge of turning, as an explorer traveller, you're only one person on the ground in one place looking at things with your senses. And now, map making is, you can do it from satellites, you can do it from aeroplanes, and you get a view that's actually much closer to, the thing you're trying to depict on a map. Whereas if you've ever actually tried to, navigate in the field, it's very easy for the things you see to be wrong. And not just because you're ill, but also because of things like mirages. Also, you can have instrument failures and problems like that on a journey. And so it's trying to turn this sort of like experience of being in a place into a sort of, a bird's eye view projection of it. And that's like really quite hard. And it's really hard if you're doing it under, the conditions of an expedition that isn't necessarily going very well, and particularly if you're ill. So, yeah, I think Burton and Speke both struggle with it, but explorers in lots of contexts struggle with it. Another case study I look at is in Antarctica, and you have expeditions go there and they report land, and it's often mirages of mountains, or they mistake iceberg for mountains, and then later explorers sort of will come through and will sail their ship directly through where reported land was. And so, yeah, there is a real challenge, I think, in this period, and it doesn't get solved until I think European empires are sort of more in control and can send teams of people out. If you think about, say, like the Survey of India or something like that, where they map the continent in a much more structured way, involving whole teams of people rather than two people ill and lost, which is often how Burton and Speke were, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Mapping is embodied in various ways, and I suppose that really quite disturbing quote that you had up there about the dream. Actually, I was thinking, gosh, that could be analysed so critically through gender, race, and sexuality, for instance, right? So I think if we're thinking about embodiment, we've got to think about intersectional kind of identities of all kinds operating through this landscape. And am I right that there were lots of women on the expedition,
Yeah.
Zanzibari women on the expedition, and there are images of the Zanzibari women as well?
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just all men going out exploring the source of the Nile, am I right?
No, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So there were lots of women, like sometimes the partners of the porters, and sometimes children were on the expedition, some were enslaved, some were free, but yes.
Yeah, because there's this image, I think, of like a whole group of Zanzibari women from the expedition. Yeah, anyway, so I suppose the point I'd make is that thinking about embodiment as intersectional is one way forward. Another is to kind of actually think about how mapping requires the human body to be part of a set of instruments as well. And so there's a way in which it becomes disembodied too, I would argue. And so that's maybe the point that I made in Waves Across the South when I was describing the Madras Observatory, where a whole series of experiments were conducted to determine the curvature of the Earth, for instance. And there are Brahmin pundits, South Asian astronomers, British astronomers, or even French astronomers who become British to make it even more complicated, were part of this observatory, which is like a kind of data crunching machine almost. And so the bodies were part of all of the instruments in the observatory as well. So there's that aspect that we should keep in mind. And I suppose it's deeply sensory, right, mapping? And so one of the things I was trying to figure out in putting the presentation together late in the evening was how actually that British map from 1794 is from above. But there are a lot of cartographic or map images. Cartographic I use as more a wider category, visual images maybe, which are actually from the ship looking at the shore, or from just inside the hinterland of Colombo looking out to sea.
Yep.
So really, I suppose what I'm saying is that the way you see Colombo looks it depends very much on the line of sight.
Yep.
And it also depends very much on what you're looking for on the coast. Whether you're looking for moss, or whether you're looking for cinnamon plantations, etc. So I think that kind of form of embodiment about where you're looking from is really crucial to the archive of maps in Colombo. So, and additionally, I would say that maps, in addition to being embodied, are also materialized and arise out of material context. And so the ecological point is really crucial. So I'd add to embodiment, the data machine, the sensory, intersectionality, and materialization.
Definitely. I think putting together what you both brought up, I think that the creation of maps as material objects in some ways interacts with the embodiment. So the embodied practice of map making, that you have to go through all of this work to do it in the case of those expeditions, or in something like Colombo, we need to do surveying. We have all the instruments for that surveying. There's a huge group, particularly for something like the surveys that would be involved in Colombo. They have an entire office of the Survey of India that's based there. So there's an entire large group of people that are behind all of these things. But then as you continue to take the object from manuscript into a more cleaned up manuscript version, into the proof stage, into then the printed that goes with the book, we're kind of, each stage of that, we're leaching out the number of people that were involved in making this to get to our solitary explorer, because this is kind of that high age of that for the African expeditions. But similarly for the Colombo maps, it ends up being from a publisher, and then we're encouraged to think about the space more than we are about the people who made that space. Which might be a wider kind of imperial process in general when we talk about materiality. So I think that interplay of materiality with embodiment is kind of an interesting fact we can see from all of these maps. To go to one from the audience, I'm interested to see what you guys think of this. So was map making in its early days, so kind of in earlier periods, more focused on accuracy and economic development than on geological, or I guess we could take that as geographical as well, relevance? So kind of, could you speak, let's take it as, can you speak to that interplay of what these maps are maybe for? Are they about capturing the geography, or are they about capturing kind of the potential for economic development of these spaces?
Yeah, I think Burton and Speke, I think they're more focused on the geography, because they've been sent specifically on an expedition to try and find the lake that was the source of the Nile. But I think that's not necessarily typical of travellers in Africa in this period. I mean, David Livingstone particularly was sort of looking, you know, he's a missionary traveller, so he had his maps always have this sort of like subcurrent that he's interested in converting African people to Christianity, so they can also be like religious dimensions. And like lots of explorers talk about, like commercial prospects. I think what's interesting as well is when you look at older maps of Africa, so if you go further back in history, sort of before the beginning of the 19th century, there's actually lots more information on European maps of Africa. And then about 1800, they sort of go, the Africa goes blank again on European maps. And I think that's because before that, people used, the accounts of ancient Greek travellers, they used oral information, they used all sorts of different sources to put features on the map. And then about 1900, people sort of start saying, well, if we haven't sent a team of explorers, about 1800, sorry, if we haven't sent a team of explorers out to look at it and it hasn't been sort of scientifically measured, we're going to take it off the map. And so you find these blank spaces reappearing. But yeah, there's all sorts of things on the older maps that we wouldn't put on them now, kind of like sea monsters and different creatures you might find in different parts of the world and things like that. So what you record on a map definitely changes.
I would just say there's a Swedish-funded project right now called Unmapping Africa, and they've done a great visualization of that. So we have 16th and 17th century maps of Africa that are very filled, usually with very wrong information. And then as we get into right around 1800, they get stripped out because there's a lot of imperial interest in Africa now, and they're realizing they can't rely on this previous information, so they need to kind of have a tabula rasa to be able to create the economic spaces, but also the geographic expeditions that they want to kind of then refill that space into something that's more useful for empire in many ways. So look up, if you Google Unmapping Africa and maybe throw a Sweden in there, I'm sure that the visualization will come up.
Should I say something on this question as well?
If you want to.
I think that actually it's very hard to separate out economic considerations from geographical considerations in the history of mapping, because they keep popping up all the time, right? So if one thinks about those early maps of Taprobane, Sri Lanka, that I showed you at the start of the presentation, maybe you could say they're tied up with trade concerns because it's about pepper and about elephants. And so, elephants are being transported out of the island for many centuries, and pepper clearly is a really, really important commodity of early trade, and maybe is one of the pathways to the plantation economy in the Indian Ocean world, the cultivation of pepper and the way pepper moves from India to Indonesia and is planted there by early modern Europeans, for instance. So really, an interest in the economy is not absent in those early maps. And clearly, an interest in economy is very central to the infrastructural projects of late modern Colombo, because it's about all of these steamships coming in great number. And if one thinks about the cargo that traverses the Indian Ocean today, and as we know from the blocking of the Suez Canal over the pandemic, for instance, I think it was, there's a huge amount of our trade that goes over this landscape. And so for that trade to transit through the Indian Ocean, it needs to be mapped. But it also needs to be dredged, by the way. It needs to be mapped and dredged at the same time, and huge amounts of sand needs to kind of be taken out of the port of Colombo and reorganized so that deeper and deeper ships can come. So I think that, the commercial, the infrastructural, the cartographic are really intertwined. On accuracy, I think it's really tough to comment on accuracy because I think accuracy is often constructed in these maps. And so, yes, there might be the monsters that you mentioned in earlier maps, but the coast is changing all the time today, and there are all kinds of tales that are told. Like, for instance, in the middle of the really catastrophic tsunami that hit Sri Lanka, these ancient stories were retold in relation to bad governance, and was the island governed badly. And so there had been a tsunami. And so the kind of ancient stories, which I kind of cited earlier from the Mahavamsa, actually had another life. So, so what I'm saying is that actually, tale-telling and the construction of accuracy is a consistent feature of the history of mapping.
Definitely. The specter of Matthew Edney would want me to add that, yeah, he hates when we talk about accuracy in maps because accuracy is so culturally constructed, and instead would rather ask that what are specific people at specific times making maps for? Because very often we're saying, oh, that's not very accurate, but the map wasn't made for accuracy. It was made to show something thematic, or it was made to show land borders and things like that, where actually the scale doesn't matter as long as you have the approximation of where it is within the landscape correct, in terms of that this is the division between this wood and that wood is where our two lands are separated. So we need to kind of take these maps as within the context with when they were made, as opposed to searching for accuracy or hoping for accuracy, because that's something that we moderns are very, very concerned with, but past users of these maps wouldn't have been as worried about. You touched on this, so I just want to stick it in quickly. So what is it about Colombo that causes multiple powers to insist on maintaining it? Because it seems like it's quite a lot of work to maintain this harbor, at least.
Yeah, well, I suppose here maybe I should just state the geographical point that it's at the center of the Indian Ocean. So, for that reason, that's a simple answer to the question, right? To say it's at the center of the Indian Ocean. And so the Portuguese need it. The Dutch need it, and the British need it, and the French wanted it at times, and the Chinese, of course, now need it as well. But another way of kind of maybe glossing that in a more complicated way is to say it's at the fault line of various cultural forms. At the moment, it's in the middle of the Cold War between India and China, and so that's partly why it's strategically very significant to the Chinese, but also to the Indians. And at the same time, if one thinks about the Dutch, it's partly about the Dutch moving north, for instance. And if one thinks about the British, it's partly that actually the British take it quite under a different arm. It's made a direct crown colony, so it's not under the East India Company. So it actually becomes much more colonized. The word colony is used in the period, for instance, for Sri Lanka, whereas it wasn't for India. And that's because it's under the crown rather than the East India Company. So it's sort of, I would say, at the fault line of various things, in addition to being at the center of the Indian Ocean. But a crazier answer would be to say that it's actually been alluring in various ways. The elephants, the pepper, the fabulous geography, people just couldn't, it was magnetic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, I can debate that later.
I was going to say, I wanted the elephants to come back round. And then for Ed, on the maps of this part of Africa that you're looking at for this expedition, we know you do lots of other expeditions, what kind of information was being missed by these maps? So something about spirits, local legends, or information about traversing the space that's not being caught on these two-dimensional maps?
Well, one of my favourite letters that of documents in the RGS archives is from Speke's later expedition when he goes back to East Africa to try and reinvestigate these lakes. And he submits a journal article to the Geographical Journal, and it sort of outlines his expedition, where he's been and what's been going on. And the really interesting thing about this journal article he submits is so much of it is about East African politics. So he's talking about how he can't go this way because this person's at war with this one, there's conflict in this area, and it's all about the complex politics that's going on at the time. Anyway, it gets reviewed by Francis Galton, who is involved in so many different fields, but he basically, he's real big in eugenics and things like that. But he basically, his review of this journal article was, oh, well, there's some interesting bits in here, but it's too much on African politics. And so what happens is it gets eventually truncated, and then I think eventually Speak decides not to publish it. But it goes from being an article that's like Speak's entering into a world which is, you know, as complex and dynamic as Europe was at the time, to looking like he's going on an expedition where, you know, it's a blank space. He's encouraged by the sort of geographers to take that out. And I suppose that's what I think gets missed, is if you read their accounts, they are encountering like complex and sophisticated African societies, and having to like acknowledge that complexity when they're in the field often. But I think that gets really trimmed down in the sort of maps and published accounts they produce.
Definitely. And in talking about control, Julie MacArthur just wrote a really interesting article about the oral, so that what you hear, so A-U-R-A-L, I guess, oral, not oral like speaking. We should differentiate those words more. So about oral, the importance of orality for Somali nomadic peoples in East Africa. And she has some choice quotes from the colonial mapper there, because he's trying to kind of map where these people live for the colonial powers that be, but they keep moving. And they even tell him at times, like, if you map us here, we're just going to move over there. Like, we know what you're doing, and you're not the boss of us, kind of a thing. And he's pulling his hair out, you can tell from this journal. And that one of the main ways also that people demarcate their current spaces and where their kind of family group is going to be for a while, and that means that other family groups should maybe not use the same resources, is actually through touch the mic, how bad of me, is through the bells that they keep on their camels. And so going through the landscape, if you can hear the bells, you know that you're not supposed to stay in this space, you need to go somewhere else. So I think that the sound part is something that we might lose in some of these maps as well. One of the audience members says that their experience of Colombo was that landmarks ended up being much more effective for getting around than maps were. And are there certain landmarks or certain kind of markers that get put on maps more often than others in the history of mapping? Or should we maybe put what would be more useful for Colombo for people to get around on these maps?
No, that's a good question. And yes, Colombo is changing so much. I mean, it's astonishing. Every time I go back, it seems to have changed. And one of the reasons I got into this project on the history of Colombo, which I showed at the start of the presentation, was I went back after a couple of years and just looked out at the shoreline and saw how it had changed because of the Belt and Road Initiative, and was just so shocked. One of the reasons why people find it very hard to get around is because it's always changing and it's always under construction. And buildings, colonial era buildings, are just being demolished, for instance, at the moment. But that really is part of the regular experience, one could say, of the global South City at a time of the times that we live in, right? The city is changing dramatically, and population numbers in global South cities are, really, really increasing. And so I think, yes, inevitably then, it's difficult to find one's way around if one's visiting or if one's passing through. Landmarks. So landmarks were really critical to the city. I mean, the old kind of tale about why Colombo became Colombo, the city, is because there was a big mango tree, actually, called Umber. Umber is mango. So the tree was the landmark. But that maybe was slightly romantic and mythologized as well. But clearly, I think in the making of cities, landmarks really matter to human beings, is a broader point that could be made in relation to that question. And that has recurred. In the colonial era, maybe the clock tower, which was built, but also the Golf Face Hotel, which is said to be one of the kind of earliest hotels in Asia, which stood facing the harbor. Recently, in this huge arm of sand, which has been built in the sea at 90 degrees to the original coastline, a plan was announced to build a new clock tower as a landmark. So I thought that was quite interesting because it was like a return to the British colonial kind of imagery, sure, but at this new moment. So I think the broader point is that, yes, landmarks matter in various ways, and people need landmarks, but also we seem to kind of fall back on older ways of thinking about landmarks, I guess, and trees certainly matter a great deal to resident communities in Colombo, to the present as well. I mean, one of the things I love about the city is how if you walk on some of the pavements have been lifted up by roots. So you have to like literally, there are places where the path on the pavement has been like rebuilt around a system of roots.
Sure.
And it's like super cool, I think. So yeah, trees as landmarks as well, I think, yeah.
I think you've covered that one. I don't have much to add.
No, but that kind of brings to one of the things that I wanted to bring up is so how is physical geography actually affecting these expeditions and these mapping practices? So it's like, how is the land striking back itself here? And you really touched on this with Colombo and the ways in which the need to dredge and kind of like the sea itself is so changeable that it makes it really hard to map. And similarly, parts of African geography make it really hard to just say, oh, it was like this when I was here, but it's probably different now.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about this map is one of the things they talk about a lot on the map that's not really discussed in the sort of like in the sort of more polished versions of the map that are published is they talk a lot about how thorny everything is. So they're like, this country, you know, this is thorny country, and it's because a lot of the porters who were carrying their supplies weren't wearing shoes, and so this had a really big impact on like their ability to travel. You know, if they traveled through thorny, brambly country, like the porters would arrive in camp in the evening with their feet bleeding, you know, and that would really slow the pace of the march. Like the next day. So that's a big thing that's sort of in the map and in their accounts that you don't otherwise appreciate. I think the other thing that they talk a lot about is the rains, you know, the seasonal rains in East Africa and how that interacts with you know, the diseases they get, malaria, things like that. And a lot of these diseases are sort of seasonal and timed with the rainy season. So I think that's a big part of the geography. And conversely, there's this big search for sort of hill stations in an empire because, you know, there's this idea that if you go up in altitude, you might get away from some of the insects and that might protect you from some of the tropical diseases. And it's a big part of, you know, British colonial rule in India and other places, and also in parts of East Africa. So Burton and Speke talk a lot about when they go to a mountainous area, they're like, oh, the fresh air here is lovely and we're feeling much better. So there is this interaction with the physical geography, and that is part of the way in which this expedition does pave the way for, you know, future colonization, I think, is that they're saying, oh, this area, you know, this area is a nice place where you could have a European settlement. Don't go to get here because there's more fever and more malaria.
Yeah, I mean, I think just very, very briefly, in a wetland like Colombo, yes, it's impossible to actually totally build a city, right, or to have a totally stable city, I should say. And so various things happen. The Kalani River, which appeared in some of the maps, which is to the north of the city, floods. And I think maybe over a long time, its course has actually really, really changed, the way it meets the sea. And so that explains the flooding. Another thing which is really interesting to track is the lake at the center of the city, which is the Beira Lake, it's called, which was in a lot of those maps, but I didn't have time to actually go into it in detail. And it really contracts as the city is built. Originally, it may have been the place where the Kalani actually met the river, met the sea, sorry, the river met the sea. So I think, you know, these sorts, so in a sense we shouldn't, the map or the mapping tradition makes us assume that things are stable and that nature is stable. But there's so much changeability happening beneath all of this in a place which is a wetland. And we've got to keep that in view. And so the lake, you know, keeps changing through the course of the 19th century, partly because of urbanization. But then there's a problem about where all the water goes and, you know, what happens. And so various environmental issues arise as a result of that, most notably around the pollution of the lake as well, around industrial purposes. So I suppose urbanization and mapping here, if that's what I'm talking about, is being imposed on this wetland, but the wetland, you know, doesn't conform in various ways to what is expected.
We've had a couple of questions, and this transitions into that quite well, about these kind of more watery spaces, which both of you brought up with Ujiji and then with basically all of Colombo having lakes in it and a river through it, and then it's a coastline as well. So both of you discussed efforts to map these aquatic spaces. How do you see the effort and the challenges of shoreline geographies in particular in relation to the Imperial project?
Shoreline geographies, that's great. So I suppose that there is a tradition of thinking about this in relation to what's called Enlightenment colonialism. So the idea here is that when you're on a ship, or when you were in the early modern period, when you're on a ship and you're looking at the show, it's a straight line, and you want that straight line to actually represent the products of the Enlightenment, right? So you want it to represent an ordered settlement, you want it to be radiating light out to sea, you want there to be a church, you want there to be, a plantation maybe, possibly, and then you want your eye to be taken from the show to the hinterland, into sort of, various forms of vegetation, which could be managed in various ways. In island societies, for instance, you may desire to have a mountain, Pacific Islands, look at Katie, in the background as well. And that is, the enlightened scene, but also the romantic kind of scene that you wish for. But clearly shorelines are not like that and don't operate like that for the reasons we just spelled out. And so, they keep changing. But also, really, what's really kind of striking about the colonial project is that it's ruining coastlines in various ways as well. If one thinks about the Belt and Road stuff that I was mentioning a moment ago, but also the British kind of breakwater project, right? And so that generates erosion, that generates species loss, that necessitates actually forms of labor, which maybe I should have emphasized more by this point, on the show as well. And so what you're getting is, people being displaced, clearly. So in the Colombo story, something which I didn't mention actually, is that fishing communities who've traditionally fished along this shore are having to move to make way in the 19th century for the breakwaters, and then now certainly as well. And these are kind of migrant communities who have moved between India and Sri Lanka at times as well. And so why that's relevant is because they're ethnicized as Tamil in that project, and the Tamil community is minoritized, and there was a whole civil war around this in Sri Lanka. So that's not the only pathway into the ethnicization of Tamils, but it's one pathway that's interesting to keep an eye on if one is interested in mapping and the city. So really what the point I'm making is that there are all these ways in which the Enlightenment romantic kind of project doesn't work, but it is also a violent one, a violent intervention. And then fishing communities can strike, fish stocks can be depleted, and whole other problems can arise on the shoreline as well, as it doesn't conform in various ways. Yeah,
a slightly different angle on this one, but I suppose one of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to sort of coastline and aquatic spaces and empire is I guess the thing we've got to remember is for a lot of the history of empire, empires were marine things. That was how you travelled around the world, right? There was no aeroplanes, and in Africa, until the empires were there, they didn't build any railway lines in a lot of parts of the continent. So there was this real effort to map. A lot of the maps of the African coast were charts, so that you could navigate around it. And then in this period in the 19th century, there was this effort to explore the interior of the continent. And I think there was various efforts, and I think David Livingstone's Zambezi expedition is a really interesting example of that, where they're trying to use the river. And I think they want to use the river because travelling on a boat kind of reduces your dependence on African politics, on local food supplies. You can travel to some degree on a calm, smooth river, independently of the geography. Ideally, you can just sail up it. It doesn't work like this because they find all these rocks and rapids on the Zambezi, and the expedition is essentially a failure. But I think there is in this period, an effort to use rivers to expand imperial control. And it's interesting when you look at explorers in Australia in the same period, is they're always looking for rivers that go into the interior, but they often don't exist. And so by the end of the 19th century, there's this acceptance that if they're going to do expeditions, they're going to have to get off boats, they're going to have to travel overland. But I think coastline, it's the bits of a country that were more, like open to European control often because Europeans generally arrived on ships.
Yeah.
Well, and for the African expeditions, because they are river focused, this shoreline geography, that's the whole game.
Yeah.
And that's why we get such a big feud between Speke and Burton. Is Speke says, I have the answer, and Burton says, you certainly do not. Yeah. And so then it's back and forth, and it's really their knowledge of this geography that is their purchase and what leads to their public debates and things like that. So it's this who gets the credibility and who are they depending on, and then that's where Speke then again gets in trouble on the Grant expedition, is he comes back and said, no, really got it this time, super certain that this is the source of the Nile, and then that's when they ask him to, and then that is when he brings with him some of his indigenous intermediaries, and he says, like, here, ask them, they know as well, and then it becomes a very large debate about, again, whose information are we trusting, whose information are we not trusting. And I think in these mapping efforts from 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, as they're tied into empire, who gets to be credible and who gets to be credited with these maps is a really interesting discussion that feeds into larger discussions about imperial power.
Yeah.
That was all.
Oh, right, sorry.
Done. Solved it. All right. Let's really bad. We've talked about shoreline geographies. I'd like to talk about your islanded ideas for a sec. So, as a questioner puts it, Sri Lanka wasn't the only island to be oversized in maps. So could it be that cartographers regarded sea as a waste of space and disregarded consistency of scale in order to share islands, show islands in more detail. So I think we've touched on that actually the sea is a really important place, so they're not disregarding the sea. But can you talk a bit more, and maybe Ed, if you want to go to the Antarctic, can you talk a bit more about kind of islands and the importance of islands in these imperial geographies?
The Antarctic is an island? Was that what the...
No, but there's islands there.
Okay,
there's important islands off of Antarctica.
No, absolutely. So I've been very interested in islands for a long time, and used to work in the Pacific, which is the first book that you mentioned as well. So I've been trying to think through how to bring islands into the center of history. So I work in the history faculty, and oftentimes wider world history is about continents. It's about the history of Africa or the history of East Asia or the history of South Asia. And the small islands get marginalized and don't actually get much attention in history syllabuses. And so I've had this whole thing about trying to bring the islands in and try to kind of center the islands. So I think, the questioner is right that there could be a sense in which they're oversized in maps, but kind of curiously, they're undersized in other things, like in historical telling, and so that's kind of weird, I suppose. Or maybe they become undersized over time. I'll have to kind of think about that a bit more, because they retreat as people get more concerned with continents, maybe. Maybe you want to comment on that. Maybe there's a swing from islands to continents through the course of the modern era. And modern colonialism certainly kind of takes up that trajectory in terms of the move into the hinterland through these expeditions that you're concerned with. So that's one way to kind of relate to this. But one could argue that islands are really, really crucial, nevertheless, even if they're being oversized and undersized, to various things which determine our present condition, right? So if one thinks about the plantation economy, that's a kind of clear one. Islands are really, really crucial. One could say that they're really crucial for analysis of biodiversity or analysis of environmental change. They've been crucial to the history of anthropology as stations, field stations. They're crucial to as prisons. They're crucial to experiments in state making. They have been places where new political ideas have been kind of cited, utopia, for instance, or maybe even the Republican experiment or the castaway on the island. So I think that, yes, they're oversized in various ways on maps, possibly, but they sometimes get undersized over time. But I would still insist on their significance and importance, really, to the way we think about where we're at right now. And I suppose for environmental reasons as well, which were behind the changeability of the island of Taprobane in some ways, all the tidal waves and all the kind of changeable geological kind of features of the island of Sri Lanka, which probably was connected to India at some point. One highlights once again that there are actually crucial places to think about the environmental presence. Think sea level, for instance. So we should, please let's think about islands I seem to be saying.
More islands.
More islands, please, not less.
It's slightly different, but when you mentioned Antarctica, I was just thinking that like Antarctica was, historically oversized on maps until Cook, sails around and shows that there's not a big southern continent there. So this I suppose this oversizing of things on maps does happen quite often, and I wonder if it's, I don't know, like, is it about the human imagination as well? Like where there's, you want to imagine something like bigger. I think Robert Falcon Scott, on one of his expeditions, he talks about the expedition's photographer Herbert Ponting, who had travelled across the world, but he was giving a talk about his various travels to the other Antarctic explorers, and Scott's really critical of him because he says, he has this tendency to oversize everything, which is the difference between a sort of a traveller and a real explorer. A real explorer will measure it properly, whereas a traveller will see something, and your first impressions of something are always bigger. You always assume the mountain's the biggest mountain you've ever seen, and it's only when you've properly studied it. And I don't know how true any of that is, but I just think it's an interesting idea in terms of like when do things get sized down, and it's when these more Enlightenment scientific methods are applied, isn't it? So maybe there's just this sort of tendency before the sort of these scientific expeditions just to, if you see something put on a map a bit bigger, I don't know.
Right, which then leads to actually really big geographic debates, particularly in the 18th century, because if you oversize something in a map to a space like the Pacific, and you don't have a lot of geographic information about that space, so people depend on any information they have, including maps, charts, any reference in a book, and so then if you sail there and the thing isn't there that you saw on the map, that's going to then lead.
This is your work, by the way.
This is mildly my work.
The missing island. Yeah.
But I think islands are a really interesting way to think through a lot of things about islands, including, about maps, about themselves, and including, again, credibility and things like that, but also ideas about geographic chimeras and why do certain things stay on? Who are they of use to, whether that be an empire or a sailor or an indigenous community? And we could talk about this for ages, but we're gonna leave it there for now so that we make sure that we respect and have a lovely coffee break. So please do go to have coffee break if you're here in person and speak of elephants and empires here in the main hall. And if you are online, please rejoin us for the next panel where we're gonna talk more about indigeneity and archives. Thank you.